methamphetamine as an example, because the amphetamines are the only class of drugs of all of these things, like heroin, cocaine, marijuana. Amphetamines are the only class that will or can produce neurotoxicity, that can damage brain cells. Whereas cocaine at high doses, it's really hard to produce neurotoxicity. Heroin at large doses, it's hard to produce neurotoxicity. So if you're going to see really brain effects with a drug, it would be with one of the amphetamines first. If you don't see it with the amphetamine, then you're definitely not going to see it with something like heroin or anything else that's not an amphetamine. But the amphetamines given to animals in very, very large doses that are 20 times, 40 times what are taken by humans, you can see some damage to the cells in the brains. Now, but if you give that same large dose to an animal after you have allowed the animal to become tolerant, giving the animal the drug at lower doses on several days before you give the large dose, you don't see the toxicity. The point is that it's very hard to produce neurotoxicity or brain damage using these drugs, especially at the doses that humans take these drugs. So when people claim that these drugs cause some brain damage or some brain change that is negative, there's no evidence for it. And that's what I'm showing. I'm trying to show people that these statements about drug-induced toxicity, neurotoxicity in humans are not supported by any evidence. Now, maybe later in the future, somebody will show some data that they do. But at the moment, there is no evidence to support that conclusion. There are biases when assessing the cognitive functioning of substance users, no matter what the substance. For example, we can say the drug users were outperformed on two tasks, whatever the task, our memory task and attention task. They were outperformed by the control group. Now, the researchers will conclude that the drug users are cognitively impaired or have a deficit. When that's not necessarily the case, because there is a range of performance that's considered normal. Just like there is a range of heights, like people's height, you can be short, you can be tall, that's considered normal. The same is true with cognitive functioning. In order to determine whether the scores fall outside of the normal range, the scores of each participant has to be compared with scores that are appropriate for their age and for their educational attainment. If that's not done, then we can't say that someone is impaired or not. And oftentimes in science, they don't make that additional step because it hasn't been required. Because we have had we have decade-long biases against drug users. And so it was okay to publish saying that this group is impaired based on evidence that you don't have. And now more people are paying more attention to that in the literature. So the literature has been biased for a number of years. Just think about this. I am sure you all know people who use all of these drugs. I certainly know them. In fact, I use these drugs myself. We know people who use these drugs, and they are not cognitively impaired. In fact, they're very accomplished people, but they have been in the closet about their drug use, so we don't know. They have concealed their drug use. So that's a major concern in terms of the literature. And so I'm trying to push the scientific community to do better, a more rigorous job. If you think about the criteria for meeting substance use disorder. So if you have a group of participants who meets the criteria for substance use disorder, that's a minority. So of all the drugs that people use, a minority of people will meet criteria for substance use disorder. The vast majority of those users do not. And so right from the start, you are biasing what you can say about the drug. I have modified my position. I am no longer advocating for decriminalization. I am advocating for legal regulation of all drugs, just like we regulate alcohol, just like we regulate tobacco, just like we regulate in the United States, in a number of states, cannabis, and also in Canada and Uruguay, they all have legal cannabis. So I'm arguing that heroin should be available and regulated so that quality controls will be in place so people will not get contaminated substances. I'm arguing that, cocaine should be available in a similar way where it's regulated for quality control. And so I'm mainly arguing for the classic sort of drugs. But as new drugs come along and as people desire them, I think we should have legal regulation. In the United States, for example, our country's founding document is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence says that each citizen has at least 3 birthrights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And pursuing happiness by using drugs, some people do that. And our declaration guarantees that as long as you're not impeding anybody else's ability to do the same, you should be fine. And so I am arguing that our country should live up to its promise to its citizens. No, there shouldn't be any criminalization because they are altering their own consciousness. They are making their decision. It's not the state's concern. The state's job is to make sure that the substances that I use are of good quality and make sure that they inform the citizens of the potential risk and benefits of that substance. That's the state's job, just like they do with food products, just like they do with other products. Driving an automobile, they ask you to put on a seatbelt and those sorts of things. The state helps people to engage in these potentially dangerous activities more safely. Drugs should be seen just like we see automobiles. You might because more people might engage in the activity. That might be one of the things that happens. But another thing that will happen, however, is that there will be fewer people who die from contaminated substances. That will definitely happen. There will be fewer people who go to prison. There will be less amount of money you need to pay your police for these undercover activities that fucking get people killed and are just costly. So you have risk and benefit, positives and negatives. I think the positives outweigh the negative. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a genie or a wizard, so I can't predict the future. But what I do know is that the pluses will outweigh the negatives. And it would be consistent with allowing adults to make their own decisions about their health, their life, their pleasure, and all the rest of these things. Okay, an example that my wife uses for this is, let's think about people who are obese because they eat a lot, right? And they just overeat. They can't control them for whatever reason. Do we say that they have lacked the food, some food items have caused them to lose their free will, and so they overeat, and we should ban that food item or put them in jail? It's ridiculous, that sort of thinking. There are a number of people, as you know, they engage in a lot of alcohol use. And so do we say that they have lack of free will? First of all, free will can be argued to be an illusion, number one, because when you live in a state that tells you what your choices are, you don't have free will. It's an illusion in most cases, right? But the job of the society is not to protect people from themselves. And that's where the problem becomes. It's like, I'm protecting you from you. No, I don't need you to protect me from me. It's my life as an adult, and that's what I would choose. Being in the United States, and being a Black man, especially in the United States, it raises the question for people who actually think, who are Black men. It's like, you might ask yourself, why the fuck do I want this life, given this? And so people who decide to kill themselves rationally or whatever, maybe that's a choice that they thought was better. Who am I to say that they shouldn't be able to make that choice, given the context? If you look at the criteria which we determine this disorder, it has a lot to do with the social context and the person's sort of level of responsibility skills. And so that person has, for example, it says something like they have tried to cut down their use or stop their use unsuccessfully on several occasions. They spend a great deal of time trying to procure the substance or recovering from the substance. They use the substance in situations that are physically dangerous to themselves. And then you just go down the list here. A lot of those criteria have to do with the person not being well developed, not having been taught some skills. And it also has a lot to do with the illegality of the drug. For example, spending a great deal of time trying to procure the substance. A drug like alcohol, you don't have to spend a great deal of time. You can go to your local shop and purchase alcohol. But something like heroin, you have to find somebody who sells heroin. So that increases the likelihood you'll meet that criteria for that. So that has everything to do with the illegality of the drug, the legal status of the drug. So my major point is that drug addiction has nothing to do with the drug. It has everything to do with all of these other social and environmental factors and personal factors. And so if a society takes better care of its people, then we wouldn't have these problems. That's one of the reasons that there are so many high functioning and accomplished drug users, because they have learned some skills to, like when you drink alcohol, you know not to overdo it because you have to go to a meeting, because you have to work, you have to take care of your children, what have you. People who have not learned those skills, or people who don't value those skills, they are more likely to get in trouble, not only with drugs, but also with other aspects of their life. The drugs are the sexy things that politicians and everyone can look at and blame. And then the politicians have a simple solution, and that simple solution gets them elected. That solution is to hire more cops, pass more stringent or draconian laws, and they look like a winner. But the problems that people really have are complex. And they're so complex that they take longer than an election cycle to fix. And so politicians are not going to address those problems because they want to have a solution that is quick, and so they can get elected in that cycle. And so the election cycle, is the most important thing to the politician. The problems that people face are complex. You guys know of these things that are called supervised drug consumption sites. Are you familiar with those things? And many countries who have those, they are proud of themselves, they pat themselves on the back. But it's really, it's sad, because if you make sure people have housing, then they don't need to come to these sites. If you make sure that they have some education about these things, they don't need to come to these sites. So rather than these sites, how about we make sure they have housing first? Exactly. That's number one. If you meet people's basic needs first, you don't have these problems.